If I'm the kid who comes home with my 92% on my test and I bring it to my dad and say, here's my test, and he says, where's the other 8%? My bid for intimacy as a young kid now gets tangled up with, in my memory, gets tangled up with shame and fear, and my brain's not stupid.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me this week for episode 266, where today we're joined by my good friend, psychiatrist and author, Dr. Curt Thompson. Listen, today's my birthday as well, so I'm pretty pumped about this particular episode landing this week. But hey, listen, about today's conversation, Curt said this: most of our well-intentioned attempts to counter the storms of our inner and outer lives involve identifying our problems and devising solutions for them. But in our hurry to diagnose and treat our diseases of the soul, gosh, isn't this true? We're often outrun by the very fear that is driving us to identify and resolve them in the first place. Hello, I'm raising my hand on that one. Listen, guys, this is perhaps one of the most emotional episodes I've ever recorded. In fact, I really encourage you listen all the way to the end. But there's a holistic approach to understanding shame, loss, trauma, and our soul's deepest desire that I trust will bring a fresh perspective and hope, like real, lasting hope to you today. So buckle up, but quickly, before we head into our conversation with Curt, listen, hook me up for my birthday. Come on. If you want to do something nice for me today, guys, do this. If you're enjoying the podcast, share it. I know I ask for it every week, but it means a lot to me, and it's my birthday. Send a text to a friend and invite them to listen as well. Do it right now, please. And then rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially on Apple Podcasts. Here's why. When you rate, review, and share Win Today, the listenership grows, and my greatest desire is to help people just like you design their roadmap to wholeness from the inside out, spirit, soul, body. It's as simple as that. Go do it right now. And then buckle up. Here's my conversation right now with my good friend, Dr. Curt Thompson, talking about the core issues of the soul, a fresh perspective on grief and loss, and the soul of desire. Get ready for this one. You're listening to Win Today. My friend, Dr. Curt Thompson, what a joy, what a thrill to welcome you back to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here today.
And my friend, Chris Cook, man, in our conversation of a few minutes in our pre-time, I'm just really grateful for all the work you're doing. Just really, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Well, here's where I want to start. The last time you were on the podcast, in fact, this is going to be fun because I feel like in many ways today's conversation is chapter 2 of chapter 1. Chapter 1 is where we started in December of 2020. But the last time you were on the podcast, Curt, you said, to the degree that we are willing to be in these confessional communities. So we were talking about shame, and you talked about the story of what happens if you had a near drowning experience. And we went back to that place and you had a community. So anyway, to the degree that we are willing to be in these confessional communities, naming those things in our life that we feel shame about on a regular basis, we find that the community itself becomes the system in which the Holy Spirit is managing our shame. So to begin, I want to reconnect healing shame to community. And then relevant to today, the social malignancy of our time and why it's not getting healed.
Well, I would say that, one of the first things that really, one of the elements of shame that we talk about in The Soul of Shame is this notion of isolation, that there is, that I think of it in medical terms. I think of it in terms of an anaerobic bacterial infection. If our listeners know anything about the difference between an aerobic and anaerobic bacterial infection, anaerobic bacteria are those bacteria that can do their damage and they don't need to have oxygen to do it, which is part of what makes them so dangerous. Because if they don't need oxygen, then just getting oxygen to it's difficult to kill them. It's difficult to kill them. And shame and that anaerobic, kind of like an anaerobic exercise workout, right? Where we wake up the next morning, we've got this lactic acid kind of overdose that we've had. And shame depends upon isolation in order for it to continue to do its work. It needs, like, it depends upon being in the absence of oxygen, the absence of light, the absence of community. And community, of course, in this regard, we're really talking about a community that is truly and fully present. And that is a community that is willing to ask the kinds of questions that are hard to ask, but that need to be asked and answered. And we may talk a little bit about that later on today,
Sure.
the particular questions that we'll get to. And so I think that, in our time, we have, part of the difficulty, Chris, is that it's not just a function of the age of social media and the age of cell phones. I mean, we have been on a trajectory arc of increased isolation for a long, long time. One might say 400 to 500 years. And given that, we have kind of been set up to have the experiences that we're having, and we might look back and say, like, gosh, it's really not all that surprising that we are in the state that we're in. The pandemic comes along, as we might have said in our last time together. It just kind of reveals where we are. And shame is kind of given kind of an open playground on which to run, because if we are already not that deeply connected to others, and by that, I mean, how many people, let alone like the faux friendships that people talk about on Facebook. I mean the friendships that people really believe that they have. And you were to say, and we do this with our patients, we will say frequently, tell me about your friendships. Tell me about them. And the very responses that people have in describing their friendships, just not just like how they talk about them, tells us as much about the friendship as the friendship itself, because what they describe is often really quite flimsy when we name this. And so the very nature of what we perceive to be the communities that we're in isn't enough, and has demonstrably not been enough to help us cope with the ills of our age that have now been complicated by where we find ourselves, medically, socially, politically, racially, the whole nine yards.
So if isolation isn't new, what have we yet to learn as people?
Well, it's, I'll just a quick, I don't know if we, again, I'll say this once and I'll say, like, I don't know what things we said before in the last one. I'll just say it one time and just, okay. So, the Soul of Shame came out at or around the time that Brene Brown was kind of becoming a thing. And, I said, people would ask me, what do you think about Brene Brown and her work? And I said two things. I said, number one, I think it's really wonderful that we have someone in our world who's currently articulating this and is on a platform that can help people become, better aware and attuned to shame and vulnerability and all those things. And I said, but the second thing is, one would think that with Brene Brown's work, one would think that we are hearing about the notion of shame for the very first time in civilization's history. One would seemingly not remember that 25 years before that, now about 30 years ago, John Bradshaw wrote the book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, that sold millions of copies. It got him a long-standing show on PBS. And we thought we knew shame. Why is it that 25, 30 years go by and we have to be introduced to it again? And I would suggest 30 years from now, somebody else is going to have to come along and reintroduce it to us again for the first time. And this is how evil operates. You read the Genesis account of chapter 3 of Genesis, and evil has no intention or desire to be the star of the show, even though he is. He is the star of Genesis 3. He gets the best lines. He has the best work to do. But when you explicitly look at his character has no interest in being famous. He just wants to devour things. And so that isolation begins with the wounding in Genesis. And then it goes from Genesis 3 to Genesis 4 and then on down the line. And we've found different ways to kind of cope with it. Jesus comes along and says, and despite the fact that in the Old Testament, there are multiple times where, an angel comes or God comes, fear not, for I am with you. The notion of I am with you is replete throughout the Old Testament. Not fear not just because like I'm going to kill all your enemies. It's fear not first and foremost because I am with you. This withness that is so Trinitarian in its nature that we as human beings repeatedly have a hard time living into. And then Jesus comes along and says, I am with you. Lo, I am with you even to the end of the age. Nobody's going to separate you. And then Paul comes along and says, I'm convinced that nothing separates us from the love of God. The challenge with that is I can read that in Paul. I can read this in the Gospels, in John's Gospel. And if I don't feel it in my chest, if I don't know that on a regularly cadenced basis, I'm going to have an interaction with people who are going to see the parts of me that I hate the most and still want me in the room, this gospel thing is not going to have much grounded impact in who I am. Oh, I can assume a certain theology. I can talk a good game, but there won't be a lot of transformation because I haven't embodied it quite yet. And so the isolation, we think that we can have community, but if I'm not having a community that looks me in the face and I feel you looking at me, it hasn't become real yet.
Well, you took us right into actually a quote I want to go right to from your new book, The Soul of Desire. And in it, you wrote, most of our well-intended attempts to counter the storms of our inner and outer lives involve identifying our problems and devising solutions for them. But in our hurry to diagnose and treat our diseases of the soul, we are often outrun by the very fear that is driving us to identify and resolve them. Will you pull this apart for us? Because I see from what you just said and then this statement from your book, the linchpin being fear. So fear does what? It hurries us to avoid the pain of investigation of the soul?
So, the world was born in intimacy. Let us do this together. Like you get the sense like it's a project that's going to require a community even from God. Mm-hmm. And then God doesn't create from a distance. He doesn't, Genesis chapter 2, there's no sense in which he says, let there be mankind from a distance. And God formed the man out of the dust of the earth, right? We are made in intimate circumstances. Mm-hmm. We are made to make things in intimate circumstances. And moreover, from the very beginning, why didn't God form Eve also out of the mud and bring her to Adam in that way? Why does there have to be a wound for a new creation out of his side, right? And we already see this, the metaphors, right? We see John's gospel, Jesus piercing in the side, this sense that like intimacy, the longing that we want for intimacy in order for us to create new beauty in the world. Mm-hmm. That intimacy necessarily may involve painful experiences. And God is not seemingly worried about this, nor is he apologetic about this. He is present with this. And he is saying, I'm in the middle of this work. And so there's all of this intimacy and this goodness and this beauty with which the man and his wife stand on the threshold, naked and unashamed at the end of Genesis chapter 2. And we get to Genesis chapter 3, and the opening conversation is wounding to her and to him. And so we find that at the very beginning, intimacy now gets tangled up with fear and shame. Mm-hmm. And neurobiologically, what this means is that, if I'm the kid who comes home with my 92% on my test and I bring it to my dad and say, here's my test, and he says, where's the other 8%? My bid for intimacy as a young kid now gets tangled up with, in my memory, gets tangled up with shame and fear. And my brain's not stupid. And so I'm not going to tell you the next time I have something that I really want to bring to you with joy. And now joy starts to be tainted. And the whole notion of being creative, the whole notion of taking risks, the whole notion of launching out into the deep and trying something new, even if I might make a mistake. Heck, I got a 92% and I'm still scolded, let alone if I make a real mistake. And so that fear and that shame, literally, those networks, those neural networks, those neurons of fear and shame become spliced together. And my anticipatory brain, when I think about what's the next new beautiful thing that God wants to make with me, I'm like, I don't know. Because I can't afford to answer that, because the moment that I do, I'm just going to anticipate being ashamed and afraid. And like, I don't really want to go there. And so, I tell folks, I have, Jesus tells the story of 3 men who were given 3 sets of talents. And the guy who's given 1, he's like, I'm not stupid. I know how this landowner operates. Mm-hmm. And Chris, I got so many parts of me that are like him. I don't just have like one part of me that's like him. I have so many parts of me that are like, nah, I'm not going there. Because I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've told folks that about the last 4 months, discovering a part of me that's sort of like, oh my gosh, I will be 59 in a month. There is a part of me like in 59 years, there is a significant part of me that really does believe that God is a tyrant. I believe there's a part of me that believes he's a tyrant, that he is that man. And, I come by it honestly. And again, it's not because I had parents who were tyrants, but if you match my parents who were God-fearing, wonderful people, but broken and they have their own challenges and so forth, if you pair them with my guy with my temperament, you discover like it's not that difficult to imagine how there is the part of me that assumes that like if I screw this up, like I'm like it's over. And God is only ever waiting to point out the parts of me that just aren't getting it right. And so part of me has to practice allowing myself to walk back into those spaces where I've learned this as a 4-year-old, 13-year-old, 17 and 20 and 30-year-old, and allow Jesus literally in my imagination and with others to meet me in that space in order for it to be healed. Because literally in my neural networks, I've got memory that has spliced longing together with God's tyranny. And until I meet a Jesus who can convince me that that's not who he is, I will forever hold that part of my mind. I will contain it. I will burn energy to contain it. And that will be energy that I do not have available to join Jesus in creating the good works that he has had waiting for me before the foundation of the world.
I mean, to the extent you're comfortable sharing, what do you do? What do you do to combat subconscious memories that are sitting deep in the limbic system, that are creating the tape playback that caused this reflex for you? I mean, like, how do you combat this? What do you do?
Chris, one way to reflect on this is, there are some in the last 20 years people have developed some, there's some psychotherapeutic techniques, EMDR, neurofeedback, sure. The model of internal family systems, all of which are really, really helpful. Yeah. Van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, all really groundbreaking pieces that are really helpful. And what I would say, and this is where the whole notion of our encounters with beauty, I think, makes such a difference. For me, I can think of a couple of instances in the last couple of years. I was on a retreat just this past week, and then I was on a retreat in September, September 2 years ago, where I was met by people to whom I could name some of my story. And they literally were saying things to me, praying over me, putting their hands on me to be present with me. And what I had to do was to allow myself to imagine Jesus being in that room with me, looking at me. And in so doing, literally shifting my attention from that moment when I was 4 or 13 or 17 or what have you, to this moment where Jesus says, I know, I know, I know, I know. Because so many of us have just never heard anybody say, I know. Mm-hmm. I see you. We have some theological sense that we're seen, but we don't have a visceral sense that I'm actually being seen. While I feel as awful as I am because I have this conviction about these parts of me that I hate the most. And Jesus says to us, I see you, and I'm not leaving the room. I'm not leaving the room. And I then actually have to sit with that, right? Because I have to, like that limbic circuitry that houses this, I have to practice allowing his gaze to rest with me while I feel these things, taking a deep breath and allowing myself to have that moment literally be transformed, to allow myself to feel him feeling me, to feel others feeling me. And of course, this can be quite frightening because I was with a group that I was leading a retreat with this past week. And, I said to them, I said, the reality is that like I'm working really hard to manufacture myself in your head because I'm convinced that the minute that I leave the room or that you do, I'm just going to disappear because there's just not that, like, I don't consider myself, like, I don't feel myself in you. Like, this is my own attachment stuff. And of course, one of them said, like I'm just completely bewildered. Like, how is that? Like, you're in my head all the time. Like I'd like to get you out of my head sometimes. Like I can't. And there is the sense in which, like, if I allow for that for one moment, that at some point, like I allow it and I have this exhale and there is my shame attendant waiting to say, like, yeah, give them a week. They're going to find something. It's better for you not, the whole thing, better to have loved and lost than to not loved at all. And I'm thinking, like, that's baloney.
Yeah.
And so it takes that kind of practice. And thanks be to God, Chris, I think I'm in a different place than I was in 2 years ago. I think I'm in a different place than I was 6 months ago. And so I'm grateful for that. But and I'm aware that the more you allow Jesus into these rooms, the more rooms he wants to take, and the more rooms you discover that you have. And you get to a point where I think, like, oh, this is great because the more freedom I have, the more comfort and confidence I have. Things like temptation will necessarily become less and less troubling for me. And in fact, it's just the opposite. Yeah, I mean, like you find yourself like in places where, like it's like the alcoholic who's been sober for 20 years and they come across some experience that just touches the part of them that is vulnerable, the right place, the wrong place, the wrong time. Mm-hmm. And, we might think, oh, this person's been sober for 20 years. They're completely impregnable to relapse. And the seasoned alcoholic will tell you the only thing that stands between me and complete and utter disaster is one drink. And I find now that the more I sense Jesus meeting me in these layers, the harder I have to work to make sure to maintain that, to practice that, to remember him being in the room telling me he's not ever going to leave. Because my brain doesn't have a lot of practice, and so I don't feel it in my body that much. It's like if I'm going to learn to play the piano at age 58, that's different than learning to play it when you're 8. And so I have a lot of work to do to make up for the time that I wasn't practicing. And this, we might think like, well, gosh, like this is America, where we should be able to, like, we do things pretty well. We practice, we get really good at this, and then we're like, we coast into heaven. Like, no, this is like the more effective you become, the harder you have to work. Now, the more joyfully you work and the more confident you become. But it's like, if I'm going to put more and more weight on the bar that I'm going to bench press off my chest, you got to recognize I may feel better and more confident about this than I did when I first started this back years ago, and I like couldn't lift a thing, but I'm still burning a lot more energy benching 230 than I am benching 130.
Mm-hmm.
You're working harder.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. It's so vulnerable. And what I hear you saying, what I heard you say is that, so if we go back to what you were sharing about being seen, what I heard you say is that being seen happens in belonging, in community.
Mm-hmm.
And the power of community breaks the stronghold of isolation, and isolation displaces shame. So there's this thread that runs through this. But there's another facet of community, and that's intimacy. You talked about it with the Elohim. Let us make man. Let us, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to propose that desire is in intimacy. It's a component of intimacy. And so I'd love to just take this straight into the soul of desire here, beyond what's obvious, beyond the identifiable diseases of the soul. You wrote this, is a desire.
Mm-hmm.
Take it from here and just teach us.
Well, Chris, one thing that has happened over the course of the last 5 years is the last third of the Soul of Shame was my attempt to offer a response to shame and what we discover in that passage in Hebrews 12 and what it means for us to be in vulnerable community and so forth. And I think I do believe that when we enter into that kind of work, that it also and it frees us, liberates us when we are no longer burning all that kind of energy trying to manage that shame, that it liberates us to create. And I believe that with all my heart. I think in the last 5 years, I've become even more convinced that there is yet this additional piece of this that I didn't really speak about in the Soul of Shame, but now this whole notion about desire kind of brings to the forefront. And that is that evil is parasitic. Evil doesn't do anything without our first wanting to do something to begin with. Evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done. And the man and the wife are on the verge of creation. They're about to create something, and evil joins the parade. He's going to become parasitic in this regard. And I want to suggest that we are people who were made as people of desire out of desire. We are God's image bearers, not just because we are able to think, but because we are people who have longing. Let us make mankind in our image. To be in God's image means we are born, we are made in such a way that the energy in our engines, the fuel in our engines is longing, is desire. And it begins developmentally, very straightforwardly, as desires of physical appetites. I come into the world and I desire comfort. I desire my hunger and my thirst to be satisfied. I desire to have my diaper changed, all these physical appetites. And after a while, they become a little more expansive and a little more complex. And before you know it, I go from desiring the toy in my bed to the brunette in 8th grade history class, right? To going to college, to joining the Marines, to the car, to the job, to longing for me. I long for things. But your point about intimacy is really crucial here, because we were destined to be people of desire in the context of community. We were destined for our desire to be for each other, not to devour, but to be with, in order then to create beauty as a result of our desire to be connected to each other. And so one of the things that the creation narrative implies is that God's longing is for us to desire to be seen, to be known. We like to have these 4 words that we talk about: to be seen, soothed, safe, secure.
Yeah.
In order for us to create beauty with others from whom we are differentiated, men and women, Jews and Gentiles, all the ways in which we are differentiated from each other. But evil, parasitically, inserts itself using shame as a weapon to actually deconstruct that whole mission, so that now desire isn't something that primarily is a function of you and me together.
Mm-hmm.
I desire to create with you in order for us together to then create with others, and so forth and so on. So this just becomes this ever expanding world of beauty and goodness. No, now I want beauty for myself. I don't want to create it as a function of giving it away, as a function of being hospitable, as a function of worship, as a function of being a blessing to the world. Wounding, trauma, shifts all this such that now when I look at the fruit, she looked and saw that the fruit was good for wisdom and for nurturing, and she took it. Now she gave some to her husband, but basically she's going to take it. He can have his own, but I move from a person of desire to a person of devouring. As shame through trauma's wounding parasitically moves in on the mission of what desire is for. And so, of course, sex is like at the top of the list of all the things that get, ruined by this, because our sexuality is our physical expression of who we are most creatively. We don't do anything more creative as human beings, more powerfully creative than make other humans.
Yeah.
Which I might add, though, at the same token, like, we're ultimately not very in charge of that. We have agency, but we're not ultimately in charge of it.
That's true.
At the same time, there's nothing that we do that is more vulnerable for us physically to expose our sexuality to one another. It's not like a handshake. It's not like a fist bump. It's not like a wave. No, it requires great vulnerability. And even the parts of us, like, you think, like, gosh, if making a kid, like, why wouldn't God build some more protective boundaries around this? Why can't you just shake hands like a certain number of times in a certain way? Like, there's no pain. There's no you just then we'll have a baby, right? Why does it have to involve parts of our bodies that, if they're exposed, are so vulnerable, literally? And I want to say, this is the intention. Yes, we are intended to create out of our vulnerability in order for beauty to emerge, because it is also what we are becoming. But when trauma enters the picture, the thing that I want to become is now just simply the thing I want to hoard, and I want to collect this and keep it. I don't just want to show people Van Gogh. I need to have Van Gogh in my house. And so it is into this space, of course, that we then discover that, well, beauty becomes this thing that we have to protect, because if we don't protect it, we're going to misuse it. So we create beauty and we put it in museums instead of being able to see beauty as part of our everyday lives, let alone imagine that beauty is what God is longing for us to become.
Is that why you propose in your book that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity?
I do. I mean, here's the thing. As we're talking right now, I'm looking outside my home office window at this massive oak tree that sits in my neighbor's yard. And of course, we've had enough trees felled by storms here in recent years that I keep wondering when that tree is going to be coming through my window, but that's another question. But this tree is Like, I have no words. It's stunningly beautiful. I get out of my house and I walk past it every day. And it's easy not to notice it because it's just here. It's easy not to notice the maple, the white maple that's out in front of my yard. It's easy not to notice certain things. It's easy not to notice because I am so distracted by all the anxiety, by all the shame, by all the fear that's banging around in my head. But I will tell you this, if all the beauty that actually is in the world would disappear, so would we. And we would discover very, very quickly that beauty does not have to be exotic in order for it to be transforming our lives. It is not a luxury. We need it to breathe. And most of all, that beauty is who we are, and it is the beauty that is emerging primarily in the parts of our stories that we hate the most. This is why we would say that, I love the work of Tom Holland, who's this British historian of antiquities, and he's written this beautiful book called Dominion.
Yes, right.
And I'm in the middle of it for the second time. And, he, in his opening section of the book, he asks this question, crucifixion, something that the Romans used all the time. They perfected it, and they literally killed hundreds of thousands of people in this way. And the artifact, the archaeological evidence is plain. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, the Romans themselves were so embarrassed by it that they wouldn't talk about it in polite company in public. And moreover, there's very few written sources of Romans keeping a historical account of it because it was so culturally embarrassing. And Holland says, and so for something that's so heinous, so much so that we don't even want to write about it, how is it that one crucifixion in particular, just one, managed to turn the world upside down? And I want to suggest that Good Friday and Easter are not just the time frame around which all world history rotates. They are the events that awaken and redeem and remind us that beauty is coming. And it's already here in its early stages. And we've been invited to start to pay attention to it, because if we don't, when heaven gets here, it will crush us.
I've never thought about it in that manner, and it's stunning. It's stunning to think about. It's stunning to wrap my mind around the cause of beauty, the reason for it, the necessity of it. And it makes me think, thus far in the conversation, in the very popular work of pop psychology today, we see it galore on Instagram. Everyone is talking about self-help and bettering ourselves. And I think the underpinning reasons are our desire for better connection, more belonging, stronger identity. Mm-hmm. But knowing what you just shared from that perspective, are we then, I hate to make this a generalization, but it is, are we starting in the wrong place when identifying and addressing core issues within the soul based upon what we've just talked about today?
Well, here's my reflection. I will be forever indebted to the work of the British theologian Leslie Newbigin, pastor, missionary. And he wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John called The Light Has Come. And one of the things that he talks about in the opening pages of his book is this notion that if it is true that the light has come in Jesus, that whenever the light comes someplace, it necessarily casts shadows. And I encounter the gospel. And, for our listeners, if, I've found the work of the online/TV series, The Chosen, to be really quite moving and meaningful for me.
Yeah, me too.
Because I'm thinking like Jonathan Rumi, the guy who plays Jesus, I'm thinking like, I just like got to find a way to like have him like move in next door so like we can just hang out, like, because this is the Jesus that I want to be talking to every day, right? And that Jesus shows up. You know, that opening scene, that Jesus shows up with Magdalene. That Jesus shows up with the disciples when Peter's fishing career and his life are nearly over. And you see his laughter. And you discover like, holy crap, this is the light coming for me. And I'm so like overwhelmed with joy. And like, you're picking me, you want me? They're like, yes, do come. And I come, and as soon as I start to come, he starts to make demands. And the demands that he makes, I can't make them. Like, I can't keep them. Like, I can't keep up. And so when we say that the leading edge of the gospel is Jesus coming and asking the question, what do you want? And I discover the very act of trying to name them reveals my inability to name them because I'm so far off the mark. When the light comes, I'm so grateful that I can see finally, and then I see, and what I see is something that I can't tolerate being in the presence of because it's so bad. And so we would say, like, yeah, all right, where do I have to begin? I begin with the notion that Jesus is coming to love me. And the moment that he does, it like is it because my trauma exists in intimacy and he's making a bid for intimacy, I have this sense of being loved. And that sense of love is necessarily going to like activate my neural networks that represent trauma. And I'm going to say, I don't know if I can do this. And so I don't know if I'm very effectively answering your question. What I'm imagining is this sense that we long for the light. This desire that I desire to be known and seen. And at the same time, simultaneously, I'm afraid to be known and seen because I'm not stupid. Because I know that as I've been known and seen in my past, in my wounded past, to be known and seen is dangerous. And Jesus makes the demand of me to trust him. And I'm like, it's just scaring the living daylights out of me to do this. And he said, yep, I know. Trust me with the next step. Trust me with the next step. That's all I ask. Trust me with one step. And that's what I have to do, right? This is like I don't know if we talked about this last time before, trauma. It's like if you have a near drowning event when you're a child in a pool, you just decide the easiest way to solve this problem is like, I just never go back to the pool. I never get in the water. Mm-hmm. And like, by the time I'm in my, teenage years, like somebody like, well, you want to go to the pool? Like, no, I'm not interested. I don't say I'm afraid. I don't say I'm terrified. I don't say that I'm ashamed that I can't swim. I say like, no, I'm not interested. This is how far and effectively I bury this until I get to some point in my life where the people that are in my life that I most want to be with are all gathering at the pool. And I'm like, Curt, man, we're having another pool party. We want you to be with us. I'm like, yeah. Every time, like at some point, like I know I can't tolerate the isolation anymore. But I know that if I'm going to do what they want, if I'm going to be with them, it's going to have to be at the pool. And so, what am I going to do? I'm too terrified until one of them says, "You just come, and don't bring your swimsuit. You just come, and we're gonna sit together on the side of the pool, both of us in our street clothes." And your heart rate's going to go up and you're going to be terrified. And I'm going to hold your hand and we're going to breathe together until your pace of your heart rate slows down. And the following week, we're going to come back and we're going to do it again. And we're going to do it again and again and again until while you sit there in your street clothes, you can come and you can comfortably sit with the chop of the water and the smell of the chlorine. And it's not a big deal. And when you're comfortable with that, then we're going to have you come with your swimsuit and we're just going to have you sit on the edge of the pool. And when you do that, your heart rate's going to go up again. You're going to be panicked, but I'm sitting next to you and I'm not leaving the room. And before this is all said and done, we will go off the high dive together. Because I'm not leaving the room. Mm-hmm. And I refuse to let you not come to the party.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really difficult because so much of our trauma is so effectively layered and hidden in ways that we would say, well, that's not traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a loving Christian home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, my parents got divorced when I was 17, but like they were great parents. Or, the hundreds of stories that we like, let alone the stories that are gruesome, let alone the stories of things that go horribly wrong in the church and in families, all in the name of Jesus. And I want to say that none of this surprises God. And this is what Good Friday is all about, right? God is going to say, like, I know exactly what it's like for you all to be in that place. And I'm going to join you. I'm going to bring you through to the other side because I see beauty coming for all of us in a way that evil could never have predicted. Evil didn't see Easter coming. I saw Easter coming. Many of our listeners are living in a perennial Good Friday, somewhere between Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Like they just know they're either their whole life or parts of their lives, they're just like they can't imagine, like they don't see Easter coming. And that's why they need somebody else. That's why we need community who can be with us, who can say, I see Easter coming for you. I say it's in 3 days. It's going to feel like 3 decades for you, but I'm not leaving the room.
It's really stunning that you've taken us here to this moment because I've been thinking about this in my own life. And then, of course, as I shared with you before we hit record here today, I was reading a section of the new book, The Soul of Desire, about grief and trauma and loss, and something that I've experienced in a very devastating way. But there was something you said in the book that is so connected to this exact moment in our conversation. It was this. You said, in the presence of our desire to be known, to co-create and become beauty with God and others, we often encounter instead a death of grief and brokenness that can make the hope of new creation seem like a cruel joke. And so what I see in that place, and what I want to say to people joined with us today, is that grief and loss coexist with desire and beauty. Like, how do we reconcile their coexistence so that we're able to move forward in life even after traumatic loss? Because I want to head there, and then I want to spend some time talking about grief and trauma as you did in the book.
Yeah. One of the things that trauma tends to do is that it tends to move us neurologically. It tends to move us into binary ways of being in the world. Life is so much simpler for all of us if I just have an on and off switch. The light is either on or it's off. And that's the only choice I have that I have to even consider making. If I got a rheostat, I'm responsible for like finding the right place. That's a little harder to do. Hence, snakes are pretty binary. They're either just still or they're moving away, right? Dogs, they can be like a little bit of both, but humans, when we have a prefrontal cortex, we have the capacity to experience ambivalence. That there is grief and there is longing in the same space, but I don't like that. I don't like that stuff tangled up with each other. I don't like to be made in such a way where there is going to be that kind of work to do. I want there to be right and wrong, good and evil. Mm-hmm. I don't like, it'd be a lot easier for me. It'd be a lot easier for me if my alcoholic father was just a purebred asshole than it would be for my alcoholic father to have so many other elements about his life that are so good and rich and generous and so forth and so on. But at the same time, there's these other things that make it like I just want to scream because of the ambivalence. It's so difficult. And then we have Jesus that comes along and names this for us. In this world, you will have tribulation. You will have tribulation. Like, this is the story. This is the world. In this world, you will have grief. You will have longings that will not be met. And then he says this interesting thing. He doesn't say, but it's okay. He doesn't say, when heaven finally gets here, you'll be relieved of all that. He says actively, be of good cheer. I'm like, what the heck? Like, how is one supposed to be of good cheer in the face of COVID, in the face of divorce, in the face, like, how does one be of good cheer in the face of grief and trauma? And this is where I would say, when he says, because I have overcome the world, he doesn't give you a math equation of how we're going to solve the problem. He doesn't give you like, this is how we're going to fix these social ills. He talks about himself. I'm going to be present with you. And in fact, my presence, looking at you, looking at me, is what is going to make the difference. And you're like, but that doesn't really like change my marriage. That isn't like, and I want to tell you this. If you imagine being in your marriage, if you imagine being with your child with whom you're having great difficulty, if you imagine being in any of your life's traumatic events, one of the things that we typically do that trauma does is that it once again reintroduces us to being people in isolation.
Yes.
So when I imagine I'm in my traumatic marriage, and by that, I don't mean physically traumatic, it just means hard. Or if I'm in any of my traumas, like I am by myself. But Jesus is saying, I'm not just with you. I want you to watch me while I'm with you in this space. I want you to see me seeing you while you're in this space. One of the things that happens neurobiologically for us that is really, really striking as we've watched this emerge over the last several years in these confessional communities that we facilitate is, at some point, everybody will say this. They'll say like, yesterday I had to have one of the most difficult conversations I've ever had with my boss. And every single one of you in the room was in the office with me. And here's the thing, Chris, about our brains and what happens when we are with somebody else. When somebody else goes with us to do a hard thing, their mere presence and my awareness of it enables me to be aware that I'm not alone, and therefore it reduces my anxiety. Confidence is not about just the construction of lots of skill sets. Confidence is about my being able to be at ease and comfortable in order to do the things that I know that I can do. And if I'm taking people with me, I'm able to say the things that I need to say.
That's so good.
One of the most important things about the healing of trauma is the presence of others to whom I can look. When we do what we call EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, one of the primary ways that intervention works depends upon how people, first of all, they develop what we call resources. We imagine, like, we're going to have you reimagine a traumatic event, but we're going to have you take your primary resourcers with you. Who are those people going to be? Well, I'm going to imagine Jesus being in the room. I'm going to imagine my good friend Chris being in the room. I'm going to imagine my best friend George being in the room. All these people are going to be in the room with me. And we're then going to replay this. And I'm going to notice them noticing me, and I am not by myself. And the very act of experiencing a powerfully difficult moment, but in the presence of the people who are coming to find you, in the presence of your sentinels. Like, this is the thing. Jesus says to Peter, if I wanted, I could call 12 legions of angels. I could call 12 legions of angels. 60,000 men. And so can you imagine Jesus doing what he did, not unlike Elisha, when Elisha's servant says, like, we're so cooked, and Elisha asks God to show him your army. Can you imagine Jesus doing what he does, and he looks around and he's got 12 legions of angels at the ready. And their centurions are saying, like, you give us the word and we're coming. And just knowing that he's not alone in this moment enables him to ask God to forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. But not without his awareness that healing is already happening even as he is breathing his last. That's what we are in need of ourselves. We're not just simply, Chris, in need of a good story and theological understanding of it. We have to have in our chests the felt visceral sense that Jesus has come for all of those layers of my story that I have buried under trauma, in order for me then to be a co-creating artist of beauty in the world, in the lives of other people as well.
This is so stunning. And I think I want to say to someone listening today, or multitudes of people listening today who are facing grief and loss and unrelenting trauma, what I heard you say, and please do correct me if in any way I'm getting this wrong, but what I hear you saying is that the experience of trauma is strengthened by our perception of the event more than the event itself. And then when we're unable to find that community and find that coalition of people, and even in the Lord himself, that support, it gives us, rather, we lack the emotional, we believe we lack the emotional, psychological, and social support to get out of the cycle. What do you think? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, you touched on something that's really important.
Okay.
About trauma. We talk about the difference between what we would consider to be, that was a trauma or a traumatic event. There's a difference between a traumatic event and a person's longer term experience of it being traumatic for them. So that's a trauma, right?
Okay.
Bad car accident, sexual abuse,
sure,
the whole 9 yards, whatever. It could be a range of different things that we would all agree might be like that. That would be hard, and we give it that word trauma. But for me to experience, it to be a traumatic event depends upon two things that we talk about in clinical circles. This definition of trauma is that we perceive it to have been an experience that, first of all, is emotionally overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed. It's too much for me. Language even is kind of difficult to get around, to kind of describe, but I feel overwhelmed. That's the word that we would use in English. And the second part of that is that in that state of overwhelm, I also find myself unable to have any agency to do anything about it.
That's it.
And this is my perception. And so two people can be in the same car accident and have very different perceptions of what just happened based on a lot of different things about their lives. They're different. And so, we can look at people and say, like, I don't understand why that was so traumatic for them. But perception is everything. And so this is what we then depend upon when it comes to the healing of trauma, because in our perception, I can end up perceiving I've had this traumatic experience, and I continue to then tell a story about it that has me continually unable to have any agency. So I just never go back to the pool. And that's the way.
So good.
That's the way that I tell the story. I tell the story in some way, shape, or form that leaves me unable or unwilling to go back to the pool, but I tell it eventually in a way that is less shaming. I just say I'm not interested. I don't say I'm a coward.
Yeah.
Because that's too shaming.
Right.
I find a different way to say I'm just uninterested. And this allows me to continue, though, even though I use those words, I'm uninterested. Functionally, the message I'm sending is you don't have what it takes to go to the pool. And that message will continue to strengthen my resolve to not go to the pool and to continue to perceive that the pool is dangerous.
I'm thinking about 2 Corinthians 10 right now. Paul said, hey, The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty before God for the pulling down of strongholds. So he says, inasmuch as we refute arguments and theories and reasonings and every high and proud and lofty thing that exalts itself to Christ, we lead every thought to captivity. So I'm thinking like, okay, back to the pool example. Stop me if I'm falling off a cliff here.
Great.
I may not be alone, but if I believe I'm alone, I'm going to think like I'm alone. And if I think like I'm alone, I'm going to act like I'm alone. And it's probably not true. Yet there's a faulty belief that because I'm stuck in this trauma cycle that is causing me to live in a reality that is anything but real. Is that true? Is that correct, rather?
So, yes. And a quick example of something that happens frequently in these confessional communities. Something will happen in which one of the members will have an experience in which they have told a part of their story that necessarily traumatic, and the rest of the community comes around them, empathically helps them tell the story more effectively. And as they do, they find this deep connection with this group of people. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, in feeling felt, they also are now able to imagine, oh, now that I feel this in light of this group and how I've been telling a story about, let's just say, for instance, my life with my adult parents, mm-hmm. I can now imagine literally telling the story about me and my adult parents differently than I could have told it literally 90 minutes ago. So this is great. So they go home. And a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, and they come back and they tell yet another story. And for them, they're like, gosh, why is it that I'm telling another story like I told a month ago about my experience with my family? And why do I feel like I haven't been able to hold on to what happened in this room 4 weeks ago, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. such that I feel like in the last week, I've been right back where I was. I thought I knew what it meant to take every thought captive, but I certainly didn't feel like I was doing that this week. To which we say, this whole process takes practice. This is why neuroplasticity is so helpful. To know about neuroplasticity is so helpful for us, because we would say that the neural payload that represents your perception of your story and the way that you tell it, that neural payload is very, very, very well practiced. Those neurons are on board. They are ready. I mean, it doesn't take much to activate them. And this new story, the renewing of your mind, the transformation of your mind that took place briefly 3 weeks ago, it hasn't had much practice. And so you're right. You're going to come back this week and we're going to do this again. And today, what I'm going to have you do is, and we do this frequently with patients, is that I'm going to want you, when you go home between now and the next 24 hours, I want you to get your journal out, and I want you to record and reimagine and re-implement what's just happened in the room. I want you to write down what you remember everybody has said. And I want you every day for the next 7 days, for 5 minutes, I want you to take 5 minutes, close your eyes, and I want you to replay this moment. I want you to begin literally in your body, in your brain and in your body, to establish the neural network pathway that represents the renewal of your mind, the transformation of your brain. I want you to do this, and I want you to come back and report on what it's like. And this becomes the hard work of sanctification.
Oh my gosh.
This becomes, as I was telling a friend last week, this becomes part of what it means for us to pick up our cross. I would like to know that I could have some encounter of healing with Jesus. You know, this is like the man born blind in John chapter 9. You'd like to think that, my goodness, like I'm healed and then everything is just wonderful. And like he was healed and his life went to hell in a handbasket. And this is what Jesus often does. He heals us and then recommissions us into a world that he can see coming, that none of us can see. Because I'm still left in the world that I'm living in. I'm still left on the world on this side of Easter. on this side of the full new creation. And he's saying like, no, I want you to practice for the heaven that's coming. And so I'm going to need you literally then to practice. When Paul talks about we take every thought captive, we like to point out, if you want to go elk hunting, you can shoot an elk with a rifle from 600 yards. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot easier to do than if I were to say, I want you to just try to capture a bull elk. I want you to capture it. How are you going to do that? Like, it's a lot harder to capture an elk. Maybe not the ones in, outside of, Colorado that are like domesticated because they're in everybody's yard. But but you know what I mean? Like if we're talking, like it's so much harder to capture a wild animal because so much more effort is involved than it is for us to shoot it from a long distance away. And if we're going to capture these thoughts, it's important for us to know, and this is where the work of Richard Schwartz and Internal Family Systems has been so helpful. There's some of these things, when we're putting things to death, what we're doing is putting to death the way in which we condemn the parts of us that represent our deepest longings. Right? There's the part of me that, sees the woman walking by on the sidewalk, and I want to linger and look and linger and so forth and so on. And I'm aroused, and there's the desire and so forth. And there's the part of me that then looks at that, the part of me that does that. Then the part of me that looks at that part and says like, what are you doing? Like, stop it. It's so easy for me to condemn that part. That's the thing that's the part that I think I'm putting to death. I'm putting that part of me that longs in. The part that I'm putting to death is the part of me that so quickly just acts on that without pausing and saying, what do you want? If Jesus were here in the room, he might he might not say to me like, stop it. He might say, I noticed that you're looking at the brunette who's walking on the other side of the street. I'm like, no. I was looking at the oak tree out my window. She just happened to be in my sight line. Right. And he says like, tell me what you want. And of course, this would be like this. Like, what do you mean? Tell you what I like? You mean you want me to admit that I want to have sex with her? Like, well, is that what you really want? Well, yeah. And he said, and if that's the case, then what is it about having sex with her that you want? What will that do for you? And before you know it, I'm like, oh, I'm a 4 or a 14-year-old or a 17-year-old who really wants to be comforted, who really wants to be confident and who isn't, who really wants to know my father's voice and who didn't, who wants to know my mother's confidence and who didn't. That's where I'm looking for something. I'm not like that. As it turns out, imagining having sex with a brunette across the street, like that's not really what I'm looking for at all. But because I don't pause long enough to be curious about what is really underneath this, I just say that's bad desire and we got to kill that. And because my first and only inclination is to kill it, I never get to what's really the root of my desire that's underneath this, to be seen, soothed, safe, secure. And so it goes underground only to show up someplace else. And this is what I'm suggesting that Jesus is coming for. He's coming for us to practice for heaven. As you see in the last chapter of the book, I wonder out loud about Matthew's rendition of Jesus' comment that everyone is going to have to give at the judgment, at the last day, everyone's going to have to give an account of every idle word. And I think, usually, I've just imagined that like, okay, now it's my turn and I step up in front of Jesus and everybody else. And he's like, well, now I'm going to be kind of like have to like explain myself for like looking at the brunette who's across the street. But what if the giving of the account is going to be a conversation that is more akin to him saying, tell me more about that. And where was that coming from? And where was that coming from? And what was behind that you really wanted? And before you know it, I get to the bedrock of my grief and my sadness. At which point I'm finally able to see him looking at me and saying like, yeah, this is the conversation that we've been needing to have. This is the account that I've been waiting for you to give. And can you, like, I'm thinking like, dude, like, no wonder I'm going to need eternity. Like, think of how long these conversations are going to take. Because Jesus is unwilling for any of this unfinished, named longing. He's unwilling for that to not be named. He wants the longing that was born into us when he first imagined us to come in to the room and do eventually what it was made to do, so that we, like Lewis in the Narnia series, discover that what we're living here is the introduction to the book that's coming. But we're going to have to walk through our trauma and our grief and name our longings in order for us to get there, because God is not going to deny himself. And if we've been made in his image, then this is how we are going to have to interact with him and with each other.
What a perfect place to land this plane, because I feel as you're talking right now, he's saying, come out of hiding, abandon the shame, because you can trust me with it. Come into community where you find your true identity, where you can see beauty, be enraptured by it, have that truest desire fulfilled, and at the end of the day, fulfill that which we've been created to do. And, you know, it's back to where we started. Community, belonging, displaces the isolation, which breaks down the power of shame, and really gives reason to say we've been created with this beautiful thing called desire. And it's at our core, and it's with purpose. And so, oh my goodness gracious, you know, I just got to tell you, you know, if you were on the podcast, I don't know, let's say 3-4 times a year, and we just had these conversations, because I'm just telling you right now, I could go another 2 hours with you, and it's just so rich. I'm so grateful for you. You are a hero in my life, and this is the second time we've talked, and I know we're getting to know each other here a little bit, but I just want you to know how honored you are in my heart and in my life, and how much I value you. And so thank you for today.
Okay. I just want to take that in.
Please do.
I want to, and it's very meaningful, and I'm so really grateful, and I love that we've gotten to do this together.
Me too.
I just love this.
Me too.
Yeah.
What a joy.
I'm grateful that there are people who get to hear your voice, which is a voice of curiosity and a voice of mercy and a voice of confidence. And God owns you. And it's a beautiful thing.
I was in my weekly mentoring session counseling last night, and I meet with a wonderful man. He's 66 years old. And I just really believe in that. I really believe at 38, submitting my life to someone who's older than me, who's gone before me, and who has access to every area of my life. And we were talking, and I shared with him last night, Curt, I said, Dave, I got the 1-2 punch, actually. So I am rereading Brennan Madding's Abba's Child right now, and then I'm in the same breath, I'm reading your new book, and the 1-2 punch hit me like this. So I came to this place, and maybe I will air this. We'll see how it lands, because it might minister to someone. Because as you said, we're intended to create out of vulnerability. So here we go. I had this picture of this beautiful but simple home, suburban home, nothing extravagant, but the lawn was manicured nicely. It was a brick ranch. It was painted nicely. It was clean. And I was like, it just felt homey and presentable and put together. Nothing pretentious, but just home.
Hmm.
And I opened the foyer and I went in, but I went layers deep inside the house, Curt. And about 4 layers inside the house, there was a room that was just framed with no wiring. And the 4-year-old me was sitting in there, shaking and crying. And that little boy was gentle and curious and sensitive. And because of early loss and early pain and having to see things that I don't think a little boy should have to see, I had a great childhood, but I'll just say it, I had to see some things I shouldn't have had to see. There's this scaffolding that I think I have unintentionally projected where I've said it is not masculine for me to be sensitive and gentle. It is not effective for me as a leader to be super curious like this. And I have been in this place of deconstructing the scaffolding of egocentricity. Not that I've been pretentious or I've been putting on a front, but I am now confronting at 38, where did I leave that little boy? And it has been, I have been crying in the last couple weeks more than I have. And I'm embarrassed and I'm a little humiliated that I have diminished that part of who I am. And it is my essence. I've always been sensitive. I've always been gentle in my personality. I've always been deeply curious. When I was 3 years old, I had a microphone in my hand, and I saved up my allowance when I was 10 years old, and I went to Radio Shack, and I bought a microphone, and I couldn't even plug it in anywhere, but I would stand and I would ask people questions, Curt, and I would stand on my bed, and I would speak, and I would preach. And when I was a little boy, I memorized news scripts, and all I wanted to do was be in broadcasting. And here I am today with a microphone in front of my face, and I'm saying I'm finally coming to terms with the fact that it's okay that I'm gentle and curious and sensitive. And I don't have to have the whitewashed walls of that house and the perfectly manicured lawn to belong and to find meaning and to be seen. And I probably will air this because I think someone needs to hear that. And it's just where I've been at. And I say that to you as a friend and someone I trust. And oh my gosh, it's just where I've been. Because I've hated that part of myself.
Of course.
Because it says, that's weak. That's not manly. That's not what people want. And now I'm coming to terms with, that's exactly who I am. Take it or leave it. This is who I am. I'll be loved for who I am by the people that are supposed to love me and know me. And for you to use even those words about God owning me, and it just kind of provoked me to share that with you. So,
Chris, what I would want to say, well, first of all, you're very kind and gracious to tell that story. And I can only imagine that our listeners, some will hear it and listen, and some will hear it and not. And for those who are listening, not just for those who've heard the story, but for those who are actually listening, one thing I want to say is that as I picture that 4-year-old, he's not just someone to which we would want to say, oh, this is who you are, which is true. I would want to say, I and we need him. We need him. We want him in the room. We need him in the world. Because there's beauty waiting to be made that needs him in order to make it. We need him. We need his vulnerability. We need his sensitivity. We need his curiosity. We need his eagerness to just pick up the microphone and preach and broadcast. while simultaneously being aware of all the things that he's feeling and sensing and imaging. And name those as they arise. We need him. And moreover, I'm just so proud of him. I mean, I want others to know him. That's what I want.
I'm writing a book right now. I just finished the proposal and working on it with my agent right now. And I think all of this is coming to a head in my life right now because it's exhausting. I'm not pretending, but it's exhausting working to ignore my essence.
Yep.
To project instead on something that I believe will be more favorable because I was bullied when I was a teenager, and I was I just had to see some things that no 8-year-old should ever have to see with his eyes, and it told me I was unsafe. And so to compensate, I've projected strength, and yet I've ignored a part of me that is now really being realized, and I'm giving space for that. I feel like there's this reconciliation with the Lord right now that has been so healing and so hard. And I think I just want to say, while I have you here, to the listeners, because I am going to keep this on the show, I want to say to you all, I'm committed to you. Not once have you ever gotten a version of me that's not really been me, but I think I'm coming to terms with me in a new way, and I hope you get to know me in a new way, is what I want to say to everyone. Maybe in a more thorough way. And so, you're such a safe place, Curt. And I think I'm not sure I would have been able to do this on air with many other people. But thank you. Thank you for this conversation today.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thanks. Thank you. And thanks be to God.
Amen. I don't know how to land this plane, but I'm just going to say this. I'd love for people to stay connected to you, to your work. Listen, I am numero uno fan of your podcast, Being Known. I think it's awesome. Being Known's a great show. So just tell people how to stay connected to you. And yeah,
you can stay connected a number of ways. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook, all those. And you can visit my website at curtthompsonmd.com. And then we do have this podcast called the Being Known Podcast.
That's so good.
My friend Pepper Sweeney and I host this together, and we've just we've just begun the recording of our third season. Second season is wrapping up, and we're really excited to be able to do it. And people have found it, have expressed their joy that it's around and available. So. Would love for people to listen to it and send it along if you find that it's helpful.
Well, you guys are gonna see. Just look me up on Instagram. You know how to find me. But I'm gonna throw some clips from the podcast as well, because I think it's worth listening to, and I think you're doing a masterful job. But I thank you, my friend, for your wisdom.
Thank you
for your sensitivity to the Lord, for your grace to share this with us, because I think this is one more step today. And in fact, I want you guys to go back and listen to my first conversation when we talked about the soul of shame. But I think what you've given us today is a gift to take one step closer to number one, truth and essence of who we were created to be. And Jesus said, when you know the truth, you'll be set free. And set free to do what? To appreciate desire, to appreciate beauty, to appreciate the reason for our creation, and then to step boldly in our true identity, to live fearlessly, as my friend Jamie Winship says, to live fearlessly in our true identity. And that's the gift you've given us today. So my friend, oh my goodness gracious, you are a gift to my life and to those that listen today. So I appreciate you more than you know, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon. I'm so proud of you.
Chris. Oh, thanks. It's great to be with you, Chris. Thanks so much.
wintoday.tv/episode 266. Go there right now. Within the show notes is a link to purchase Dr. Curt Thompson's brand new book, The Soul of Desire, as well as his previous book and the topic of our previous conversation, The Soul of Shame. And by the way, within the show notes is a link to listen to our first conversation. That is episode 221 of Win Today. Listen right now, grab a copy of the book, pass it on. But listen, next week here on the show, you asked for it, so I did it. We're having a conversation all about emotional abuse. That's all I need to say. Here's a preview.
If you say the wrong thing, then I'll react to.
There's the power and control dynamic.
Control. It's right back to by design.
By design, yeah. Yep.
So walking on eggshells is a pretty common kind of situation that the abused finds themselves in. They are literally, and I've heard people just come right out and say that. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time. And that's by design.
Listen up, next week on the show, you're getting 2 fresh episodes. This episode on emotional abuse, and then the second episode next week is all about clinical depression. You better buckle up. It's a loaded week, bolstering you from the inside out right here on Win Today. Don't miss it. Thanks again for joining the conversation this week right here on Win Today. I believe people just like you should be able to live successful, meaningful lives, and that's why I want to invite you to join the inner circle of readers on my email list who get weekly, well-researched self-improvement tips. So right now, go to wintoday.tv to sign up. It's absolutely free. And lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on the Apple Podcast app. So right now, will you write a short, honest review? Doing so helps expand the listenership of Win Today, and that would mean a ton to me. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.